Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle. I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, welcome back for another round of Libertarian Angle.
It's great to be here with our viewers and listeners, and I guess you too.
Yeah, I guess that's the hardest part. Okay, part two of World War I and World War II. As you'll recall, last week we were really setting the basis, the philosophical basis for leading up to World War I. We talked about America's philosophy of non-interventionism, don't get involved in European wars, no entangling alliances. We didn't talk about George Washington's farewell address, but he talked about no entangling alliances there. Establishing a nation here as a model of freedom for the world. We talked about John Quincy Adams and his talk to Congress about America does not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. We talked about open immigration as a way to tell people, look, our government's not going to come and save you from tyranny and oppression and starvation, but if you want to get out, and you can get out, there is a place that you can come that will not forcibly return you to your country. And then we were building up into the 1920s with respect to the adoption of the income tax, the Federal Reserve, and I'll let you deal with those subjects. You're much more competent about dealing with those than I am. And then in the events leading up to World War II, I think what I would like to talk about is really the consequences of World War II. But before we get to the consequences, let me turn it over to you and you build it up going through the origins of World War I and how we got into this mess.
Yes, I think that it's useful to have a certain historical perspective. Last time, as you correctly pointed out and reminded the viewers, last week we had talked about America's philosophy of non-intervention in foreign and military affairs, but openness to trade, commerce, migration as a new country based upon individual liberty. And I had tried to emphasize, you may recall, the political and philosophical setting as a broad brushstroke statement of Europe in the 19th century, guided by more or less the vision and the ideal of classical liberalism, so that governments were more limited, wars were less frequent and less violent and damaging, at least within Europe itself, and how nations had attempted to establish rules of warfare to minimize the death and destruction that they might cause, even if they did not always practice them as much as preach them. So from that point, what I'd like to do is to give the viewers and listeners just perhaps a little bit of a background on how the world had been transformed, particularly Europe, since America enters a war that began in Europe. In the last decades of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, that could set the stage to bring about such a terrible and violent and costly cataclysm that influenced the rest of the last 100 years. Classical liberalism's zenith can be said, from historical perspective, to have reached its high point in the 1860s and 1870s. Certainly in mostly the case in Great Britain, but through the British example and the American example, of course, in France, in even Germany, in parts of Italy, Scandinavia, Holland. But countervailing forces arose, intellectual and ideological forces arose in the second half of the 19th century that challenged and ultimately came to undermine the classical liberalism of individual freedom, limited government, and free markets. And those countervailing ideological and political forces were namely socialism and nationalism. Socialism arose in the early decades of the 19th century with a belief that capitalism was exploitive, denied workers their just due, involved a system of unfairness in which the few gained at the expense of the many, and that it could not be solved other than through a violent revolution, particularly in the Marxian form of it, that would overthrow the exploiters and create a proletarian or workers' state that would do away with exploitation, raise productivity so that humanity would live in sort of a paradise on earth as Marx saw it. There were variations on the socialist theme, but all of them had one common element, and that was a rejection of market capitalism and individualism. They talked about a new variation of collectivism. The group came first. The individual was an element in the tribe. The state was to be more dominant, controlling, and guiding, of course, in the name of the people. These were all the hopes and the plans and the intentions of socialists who had the idea of eventually, in one way or another, coming to power. The other element that undermined the liberalism of the 19th century, and again helped set the stage for the Great War, as the First War came to be called, was the rise of nationalism. It's worth keeping in mind that before the French Revolution, modern nationalism as we think of it today did not exist. There were absolute monarchies of one sort or another. Of course, Britain already had a limited or constitutional monarchy. But in all of these cases, countries were combined not on the basis of some ethnic or linguistic identity, but lands that had been conquered or arranged through marriages or exchanges through agreements that became the properties of kings and princes. And they contained many different ethnic groups, different linguistic groups, people of different, sometimes racial backgrounds. And as a consequence, the idea of a loyalty to a group as opposed to a loyalty to the monarch did not really exist. If there were loyalties other than to the king himself, it would have been to your own local area, because given the primitive transportation of that time, most people were born, lived, and died, and never traveled beyond maybe a 30 or 40-mile radius from where they actually were born. That changed with the French Revolution. It was most starkly expressed, perhaps, when the King of France was beheaded. And the revolutionary government of France had to send out messengers to inform the French people, and including the French military, that were fighting other foreign monarchy armies on the Rhine about this transformation. And an officer of the revolutionary government reached a French military unit along the Rhine and announced that the king had been beheaded. One of the commanders of the army facing the anti-revolutionary monarch forces said, then who are we fighting for if not the king? And the reply was, for the people, for the nation. That, for the first time, symbolically, created a new sense of identity and loyalty for the individual. The state itself now, encapsulating the idea of the identity of all the members within its political jurisdiction, was that object towards which all of your loyalty, obedience, and sacrifice were now to be made. Following the French Revolution and the defeat of Napoleon in 1815, these forces began to arise, particularly in Central Europe. At first, the Germans, and there was no united Germany. Germany was divided into little principalities and dukedoms, almost like a jigsaw puzzle with different colors on a map. And when the French first, under Napoleon, invaded across the Rhine into the Germanic little principalities, they first looked upon the French as liberators. The rights of man, the French Revolution has spoken about. The end to abusive governments under kings and princes. The people's will be expressed. The individual will no longer be a pawn in the purposes of kings and princes. But the French, in their occupation and political manipulation of the Germanic states, became, of course, abusive, harsh, and imperialistic. And so finally, when Napoleon was pushed out and defeated, the reaction of many German intellectuals was a sense of frustration, anger, and most importantly, humiliation, that they could not liberate themselves and had to be liberated first by the French, but then the French themselves gave a false sense of freedom, of liberation, because they too became imperialists, dominators, controllers, manipulators. And part of this reaction was to say that if the German people are not to be subjected to this again, they must become united as a single people, and that they must come to identify themselves as a single people, no longer little principalities and dukedoms, but the German nation, a German language, a German culture, a German ethnic identity, if you will. This finally culminated through a series of wars instigated by the German Principality of Prussia under the leadership of Otto von Bismarck as the military leader, to the unification of Germany in 1871 in a war in which it defeated France and unified all the German states as part of the plan to defeat Germany and to create a united German empire under Prussian control or supervision or dominance. This unification of Germany at this time also set loose, after a short period of time, another set of forces in German higher political circles around Bismarck, and that is a rejection of the existing degree of German liberalism. There had been German classical liberals. They had fought for individual rights, limited government, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, a concern not with borders, but the dignity of the individual citizenry. But Bismarck came to reject this. He rejected both free enterprise, free trade, and a belief that you had to have government regulations and protectionism to strengthen Germany so it could be a great power on the global scene. This created a new force in Europe that was soon copied by others. Already in Italy in the 1860s, that is about a decade before German unification, the principalities and dukedoms of the Italian peninsula had been united into the Italian nation, a restoration of Italian, if you dare say, a modern version of Roman greatness. And this nationalism that took the form in Italy and Germany became transformative through the rest of Central and Eastern Europe. This became a dominant force. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had been a polyglot empire of over a dozen nationalities, linguistic groups, religions, and each of them came to want to have their own autonomy and independence. The Poles revolted several times against their Russian masters. There were revolutions in the Balkans, where the Turks controlled Bulgaria, Greece, parts of what today, or what we used to call Yugoslavia, Bosnia and Macedonia, and parts of Romania. So the emerging spirit was nationalism, that the individual's sense of freedom was no longer individual liberty, but the freedom of the political independence of the national group to which one belonged and identified. Your freedom came as a German to be a united nation, independent, and being able to prevent that nation from being abused or controlled or invaded by another. A sense that one's language, one's culture, one's literature was unique, special, and superior to others. All of these forces of a hyper-nationalism, along with this other collectivism of socialism, would transform the intellectual and ideological climate of the last decades of the 19th century.
Let me interrupt you for a second. I think it's interesting that when you mentioned Bismarck, that Bismarck is also taking economic policies of the German socialists, like Social Security and Medicare, healthcare, and adopting them into his system. And that really is the roots of the progressive movement here in the United States to bring these socialist programs to America. And maybe the best manifestation of that is the Social Security website here in the United States. They have a bust of Otto von Bismarck up there, not of Thomas Jefferson or George Washington, who never would have countenanced such socialist schemes, but of Otto von Bismarck there in the U.S. Social Security website.
You're absolutely right. See, Bismarck believed that this nationalism required a sense of uniting all, quote, social classes within Germany, and to overcome what was seen as the growing attractiveness and political influence of the German socialist parties. He attempted to co-opt them, and he even said this, to gain the support of the working class by co-opting the appeal of the socialists, by introducing the features of the modern welfare state, what we call Social Security, national health care, unemployment insurance,
Public schooling.
public schooling. All of these things were meant to both unify the people and to make people identify not with a social class, but with the nation state to which it owed loyalty for all that the state would do for it, and obedience to serve, quote, the interests of the state as defined by the government. So all of these were bringing about both domestic collectivism as well as international political collectivism. Also in the late 19th century was the scramble for empires around the world. The British Empire expanded, the French Empire expanded. The Germans established colonies in parts of Africa. The Italians did so as well. And so all that was occurring, all of these conflicts, controversies, and competitions resulted also in the decade and a half of the beginning of the 20th century in series of alliances, okay, series of alliances between the different countries to sort of create countervailing checkmating forces on the European continent. And these alliances actually changed who you were aligned with several times. But the upshot of it is that finally all of these forces came to sort of fruition in the spring and the August of 1914. And out of these notions of collectivism and especially nationalism at this point, in July of 1914, the heir apparent to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Ferdinand, and his wife Sophie were on an official visit to a province of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and that was Bosnia, and they were in the capital of Sarajevo. And a Serbian nationalist, a radical, a terrorist as they're called today, it has been shown clearly by historians, with the tacit active participation of members of the Serbian secret police and political authorities to assist him in various ways, went to Sarajevo and ended up undertaking an act of murder and assassination of the heir apparent to the Austro-Hungarian throne and his wife. The Austro-Hungarian government demanded that not only an official apology, but they be allowed to go to the Serbian capital of Belgrade and to undertake an investigation to unearth who was behind this dastardly act. The Serbians resisted. The Serbians looked to the Russian Empire. The Tsar of Russia viewed himself as the big father of the Slavic peoples. And also Russia had its own territorial and other sphere of influence conflicts and competitions with Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire in southeastern Europe, what we call the Balkans. So the Russians basically ended up giving support to the Serbians and resisting the Austrians. The Austrians, fearful about the Russians coming to the support of the Serbians, now turned to their partner in an alliance, and that was the Germans. And the Germans then informed the Russians that if the Russians took any military action that was viewed as aggressive in support of Serbia against the Austrians, the Germans, would respond. Now, the whole thing was mixed up, Jacob, by the fact that all these monarchs are related to each other. Tsar Nicholas II of Russia and Kaiser Wilhelm II of Imperial Germany are cousins. And so they write letters to each other, and it's Nicky and Willie. And Willie tells Nicky, if you mobilize the Russian army, I'm going to have to mobilize the German army. And Nicky writes back, well, if you mobilize the German army, Willie, well, I'm really going to have to mobilize the Russian army even more. Don't do it, Willie. Warning you, Nicky. Now, it's almost surrealistic, but in a nutshell, they end up not taking each other seriously, and they mobilize each other's armies. And as a consequence, the stage was set in August of 1914 for a declaration of war to be undertaken, which sets up a series of dominoes. Why the dominoes? Well, you see, Russia is in an alliance to try to contain Germany with the French. And the French had set up this alliance with the Russians because they were fearful of the Germans, because it was a German victory against them in 1871 that had set the stage for the unification of the German states under Prussian leadership. And they not only want the Russian support for defense, but they want eventual revenge because the Germans annexed some French territory. But you see, the French are not only aligned to give support to the Russians, but the French are in an alliance with the British. And the British are in an alliance with the French because they want to keep a balance of power on the European continent, so no one nation is dominant and able to rule over the European continent. So you basically have a situation where Austria declares war and invades on Serbia. Serbia calls upon the Russians. The Russians mobilize and now say they're going to defend the Serbians against the Austrians, but the Austrians have now called upon the Germans. The Germans now are threatening to attack Russia. The Russians call into place their alliance with the French to come to their aid, so the Germans are faced with a two-front war on the east and the west. But then the French, to protect themselves, call upon the British to maintain their part of the air alliance. And so you now have all of these like dominoes falling of these powers. And Italy was supposed to be aligned with Germany and Austria, but they renege and stay neutral until 1914 when they enter the war, but against Austria and Germany on the French and the British side. So, and then the Germans have one other ally they call upon, and that's the Turkish Empire. And so the Turks come into the war on the German and Austrian side, who are also in an alliance with the Bulgarians against the Greeks and the Romanians. I mean, it's you need a scorecard to keep the players straight. But this bizarre thing of madness sets this war in motion. Now, the other thing, historians have often pointed this out. Maybe many viewers have seen this in documentaries. Everybody went to war with exuberant and enthusiastic excitement. War is an adventure. War is soldiers on a horse with a saber. So war makes you a hero. You'll come back with medals on your chest and admired in the parades. So armies go were cheering in Berlin, in Paris, in London, in Vienna, in St. Petersburg. And they all think that God is on their side and that they're strong and their enemy is weak and they will have been victorious and be home by Christmas, right? This is August. Now, of course, the war does not end by Christmas. It doesn't end in the Christmas of 1914. It doesn't end in the Christmas of 1915, 1916, 1917. This war goes on for over 4 years, Jacob, until November 11th, 1918. By the end of which over 25 million people have died. And large segments of the European continent have been destroyed. And furthermore, it is sucked into this vortex, forces that now change and transform the world. Two major ones. In April of 1917, the United States enters the First World War upon a request of a declaration of war submitted to the Congress by then President Woodrow Wilson. This also was a time when, in November of 1917, Vladimir Lenin and what he called the Bolsheviks, what we now call the communists, came to power in Russia. The Tsar had abdicated in Russia in March of 1917, and admittedly left of center, but democratic government had taken authority in the Russian Empire and promised democratic elections, a new constitution, Russia would be free. But this government made one mistake. It kept Russia in the war when Russia had lost the material and the military ability to continue a fight against the Germans. The hunger, the despair, the defeats of the Russians against the Germans in these ensuing months all set the stage for Lenin and the Bolsheviks to overthrow that government in November of 1917, which of course now releases the demon of, after a 3-year civil war, the triumph of communism in what had been the Russian Empire. All of these now are the forces set working, and including drawing America into the international geopolitical competition, and changes America forevermore after that.
All right, let's talk about America's entry into the war, because we need to understand why that happened. There's been allegations by historians that Germany started the war because it was firing on ships, that American ships that were traveling to Great Britain, and that America was just defending itself, creating that sense of self-defense as a justification for going to war. But that really isn't exactly true and doesn't tell the whole story, does it?
No. The United States, first of all, Woodrow Wilson, we have to understand first Wilson in a wider context. He is the first president of the United States. There was also Theodore Roosevelt, but in a more thorough sense, Woodrow Wilson is the first president of the United States who rejects the traditional constitutional form of American government. He had been the president of Princeton University. He was a professor of political science. He had written books on American constitutional government. He had written a book on the state. And he believed in this progressive ideal that the role of government was to paternalistically bring about positive change and improvement in the conditions of humanity through activist leadership guided by experts who were qualified and trained to guide the society in ways that, left alone, the society could never fully satisfy. So what he called for, he believed that the separation of powers was out of date. You needed to have centralized and concentrated power for government to benevolently and paternalistically do good things. He doubted the relevancy of states' rights in this context, obviously. He also believed that government had a strong and enlightened and progressive role in economic affairs, far beyond anything that the founding fathers could have ever imagined or conceived, either positively or negatively. And part of this was the idea that America had this special mission, both within itself and this progressivism of remaking and improving and transforming America into a collectivist ideal of welfare and reform, but also that America had a special mission to bring these same ideas captured under the title of democracy to the rest of the world. He therefore actively, in spite of rhetoric coming out of the administration, particularly when he wanted to run for re-election in 1916, when he ran on a platform of he kept us out of war, he in fact actively endorsed and supported the Allied powers in the idea that Britain, especially, but certainly also France, represented the same enlightened, progressive, and democratic ideals of America, whereas Germany was the monarch, it was the corrupt and power-lusting country, the evil in the world, the Satan that needed to be extinguished to bring the transformative, progressive truth to all of the other peoples of Europe. There was also the fact, a more seamier side to this, and that is the British had been very successful in forming both informal diplomatic and a wide array of economic alliances and arrangements with both American intellectuals and the financial institutions in New York City. The British had found that fighting World War I to be extremely financially expensive. They and the French had to turn to Wall Street for loans to facilitate the purchase of American material and armaments to feed their war machine in the seemingly unending war against Germany on the European continent. So there were segments of the American banking community who now were dependent upon the success of a British and French victory against the Germans to guarantee and be assured of financial payback of all the, what in our terms today would be billions of dollars that had been lent to them to fund their war effort. So a variety of these factors came along. The financial interests of people concerned that the debtors can repay the creditors, and this ideological push by Wilson himself, all combined to set a stage of an attitude of portraying the Germans as absolute villains, and the British as sort of this pinnacle of representing the best ideals of freedom and democracy, from which America's own intellectual founding roots came, that we needed to support and defend this. With the fall of the Tsar in March of 1917, and therefore no major oppressive and absolutistic monarch left on the Allied side, but a new democratic hope for Russia, Wilson then felt that the time had come to go before Congress and demand this declaration of war. Even though we had not been invaded, there was no significant or noticeable military threat by the Germans against America or its immediate economic and political interests. But the idea that America had to take this burden now for one purpose and one purpose only, to make the world safe for democracy, as the phrase came. And as part of this, for Wilson to be able to stand before the globe as the savior of all of mankind.
Yeah, I mean, it really was this sense of idealism through government force, that he was going, it seemed to me that Wilson had this mindset that he was going to finally bring America into this war to settle things in Europe forever. That this was going to be the war that was going to end all the wars, that American military might was going to really smash Germany, and it ended up smashing Germany, and that this was going to be the new dawn. And so it really wasn't a defensive war, despite the fact that there were some ships that were being shot out of the water. I mean, wasn't Wilson violating neutrality laws with respect to some of the ships that were traveling into wartime waters?
Yes.
And so here he's got this war to end all wars. He's going to make the world safe for democracy. And in the process, there's going to be a major transformation of life here in the United States as part of that war effort.
Absolutely. You see, once the United States entered the war, the idea was, under Wilson's leadership, the entire nation had to be unified and guided to achieve the goal of victory. This meant the suppression of any dissent, disagreement, or disapproval of the war effort. So you had the heavy hand of the government now deny freedom of speech, freedom of the press, assembly and association, the rounding up of Germans and challenging them as real citizens, a propaganda campaign in which the German names on any businesses had to be changed. The ability of little activist groups supporting the government could go into any place of business, any factory at any time, and hold what were called Minutemen moments. And these would round up the employees of this establishment or enterprise, and for a minute or two present a positive campaign propaganda pitch to support Wilson and the war. People were arrested. For example, Eugene V. Debs, as a leading example, was the head of the American Socialist Party. Yeah, he was a socialist, but he was against the war. Now, maybe for socialist interpretive reasons, but he was against the war. And he ran in political campaigns. He was not a revolutionary. He was not calling for the violent overthrow of the U.S. government, but he was an active and visible verbal opponent of America's rationale and continuance in the war. What was the result? He was thrown into prison and was not released until a time after the war ended. This happened to a variety of people. Furthermore, the economy was placed under extensive and pervasive government regulation and control. Some industries were nationalized. Planning boards were established. Wage and price controls were imposed. Distributional networks were established, not only to feed the war effort, but since the market was no longer facilitating the production and the availability of goods and services, government now had to direct not only war production, but civilian satisfaction of goods and services, since the government was now the production commander of the economy. So in fact, we not only saw denial of civil liberties, and the undertaking of a foreign adventure with dire consequences. But we also see the crushing of economic freedom at home as well. All part of this vision of America now as the global leader of bringing the world to freedom and democracy, as Wilson was interpreting these things.
Yeah, and as you point out, the whole concept of patriotism becomes totally warped and distorted. It becomes one where every American is supposed to come to his government, support whatever his government's doing, and that any dissent is considered anti-American. And as you point out, they start oppressing
Absolutely.
people for criticizing the war effort. Debs, I think, was just criticizing the draft, and they put him in jail. So now you also had the draft. You had conscription forcing Americans to go fight in this war. They couldn't teach German in public schools anymore. So prior to that time, while there had been anti-immigration fervor, there had also been open borders, mostly, and there had been a tolerance of immigration and immigrants, but not so in World War I. There was tremendous oppression against German Americans, and Germans stopped teaching their children German for fear of how they would be treated. And then you had the destruction of economic liberty as well, which really laid the basis for what later happens during the Great Depression. This collectivization, this militarization type way of looking at the economy as a military man would look at it. So we're about out of time, Richard, but we've set the framework for what happens during this war and really what war does to a society. It transforms a society, and we saw the basis for that in World War I. And now maybe we'll examine the consequences of this war. Did it really make the world safe for democracy? Was it really the war to end all wars? And of course, we know what the result of that was within a very short period of time. We were looking at World War II. But we'll also look at how the American people reacted to what happened in World War I through the 1920s and up to the time that America enters into World War II.
Well, I would just conclude to emphasize the propaganda of already the entertainment industry. George M. Cohan of the famous movie made about him, Yankee Doodle Dandy, starring James Cagney, who wrote probably the most popular World War I propaganda song, "Over There, Over There. Tell the word, send the word over there, that the Yanks are coming, the Yanks are coming, the Yanks are coming over there. Say a prayer, say a prayer, say a prayer that we're over there, over, we're coming over, and we won't come home till it's over there." That was the type of propaganda and stimulus and enthusiasm to get the people to support Woodrow Wilson's war.
That's very impressive, Richard. I'm glad there's piracy laws that prevent people from taking your rendition of that song and selling it for a profit. I mean, that was extremely impressive. Not.
And see, again, abuse. Look, viewers, abuse. See what I put up with? Constant abuse.
All right. Well, on that note, that high note.
Exactly. See, our viewers don't get just ideas; they get singing. The next time, I expect you to do some of your dancing. Right? Give them the full service here.
Sounds real good. Well, on that note, we'll sign off, Richard. Until next week.
Take care.
We'll see you. Thank you. Bye.